David, and I hope you're able to get back on, and thanks to Wendy and Frank and Cora and the folks at AIR for inviting me here today. I'd like to share some exciting progress we've made in this innovative demonstration pilot that we've been involved in called Performance Assessment of Competency Education, or PACE. I really appreciated the slide David showed with the 4 entry points, and as you can tell, I'm really going to focus on assessment and accountability today, but since we have been at this for a few years, as David pointed out, you know, we could speak to some of the other entry points as well, particularly in the Q&A. This particular slide that you're looking at right now essentially is a timeline that really, you know, shows. I'm not going to go through it. Kind of some of the high points that we've been involved in, but it, you know, suffice to say that we've been involved in competency education and then moving into student-centered personalized learning for almost 20 years. And this timeline shows how we've been doing it and what we've been doing. And you know, suffice to say, this is not a Johnny-come-lately idea for New Hampshire. It's been something we've been working on deeply for now almost 20 years. Next slide. Meanwhile, nationally, there has been a lot of thinking about accountability, and in particularly over the last 3 years, as we come out of the No Child Left Behind era, we look along with other states in the Chief State School Officers Innovation Lab Network, of which New Hampshire is a member, and a number of states across the country are members. We're looking at a new kind of accountability, which, you know, as we all try to do, but give numbers to it, Accountability 3.0, which looks at a much wider array of measures to help us get at a deeper understanding of college and career success, one that supports shifts in teaching and learning to a system that is more personalized, competency-based, and frankly, project-based, and one that more directly balances both formative and summative assessments rather than focusing solely on summative assessment. To one that is more student-centered in its approach as opposed to a top-down standards-driven system. Next slide. And you can click through until it, you know, you get through all of the pieces here. Stop now. So this is actually a pictorial, if you will, of some work that was done 2 years ago by a group that was convened actively to look at this kind of an accountability system, and resulted in a paper by Linda Darling-Hammond, Gene Wilhoit of the Chief State School Officers, along with Linda Pittenger, describing what we termed a 51st state accountability system model, where both locally derived assessments are combined with state-level checks at grade spans, and further checked through both paper and on-site quality reviews by peers and experts to really ensure reliability and validity in the system. New Hampshire's PACE pilot was designed with these components explicitly, as it was a good match to our theory of action, that if we wanted all students to be college and career ready, then we must support their mastery learning all along the way, and we also must support our educators in new forms of pedagogy to better support their students. What's important about this model is that the annual state assessments and the movement along cohorts is less pronounced in this model, and it gives more flexibility at the local level for students to move on as they're ready to graduation and on beyond. So next slide. So for New Hampshire, this really meant concentrating in a big way on complex performance assessments, as we believe if you want to really measure students' mastery of larger competencies, the skill and ability to use knowledge within and across academic domains to solve complex problems, communication solutions, complete a task, or produce a product. So before I go any further, let me show you that what the new student assessments look like, so you can have a sense as to what we are doing. This is a geometry common PACE task constructed by the high school math teachers in our 4 original PACE districts. Students were asked to take on the engineering problem of designing a water tower, one that is efficient, and to use mathematical principles as they do that work. As a hint for those math specialists on the call, there actually is a correct answer. Those here who do remember their geometry know that a sphere will hold the most volume with the least surface mass. But with that said, students are called on to develop this real-world problem and develop several solutions, and then also to write a proposal and then justify the recommendations as well as doing the math, and do that as a presentation to an external group. So, you know, the idea here is that it's not just about solving a math problem. It's about solving a real-world complex problem, and also being involved in the communication and skills in presenting an argument as to how that might be sold to a group external to their class. Next slide. So we really wanted to harness educator ownership in our assessment and accountability processes. As I noted earlier, our assessments are actually constructed by our local educators in our implementing schools. We believe that the top-down state standards and assessment approach of the standards-based movement really disenfranchise local leaders and educators from owning the process. So instead, it caused more and more of our communities and citizens to lose trust in our educators and our schools, with really what we saw as disappointing results in student growth through this change over the last 13 to 15 years. So by reinvesting in a more internally oriented system amongst our educators, where they have a hand in developing the standards or competencies, and also in constructing curriculum-embedded complex performance tasks that can be used for accountability purposes, we believe that we reduce overall external testing time and enhance real investment by not just teachers, but also the community and students in the system overall. Next slide. New Hampshire really has gone down this road for many reasons. Since we have been innovating in the competency education space for over 20 years, we felt that the earlier forms of assessment and accountability were truly holding back our students and our educators. We wanted assessments that were deeper than what we were seeing developed nationally, so that we could truly maximize student learning, engagement, and accelerate improvement in outcomes for our students. We were an original member, for example, of the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, but very quickly saw that complex performance tasks became less and less important in the overall design of that assessment. Next slide. In the 51st state model is really a comprehensive look at educator effectiveness, with a movement away from simply emphasizing trying to identify the 1 to 2% of poor teachers to one that builds the capacity of all educators through networks and learning communities. And this is really taken, this slide is taken from a report that Mark Tucker put out emphasizing Ben Jensen's work with Learning First. We talked about 4 high-performing countries or provinces, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Singapore, and British Columbia, where they had constructed new ways to think about educator accountability, where student learning is core to the process, and where educators work to improve instruction and learning by forming networks or communities of practice or support to build their skills professionally, and where educator judgment becomes a larger piece of the assessment and accountability process, something that really isn't thought much of in this country for assessment and accountability. So we began to use this paradigm following really the tremendous work that we have observed just north of the border in Canada. And we feel that this is where we need to go as we start to build this system out. Next slide. So when it's all boiled down, what we really have is a change in a model from what we think of as a state accountability model as we all have known it, and maybe not so much loved under No Child Left Behind. So where in No Child Left Behind, all districts are held accountable at once to a single state system. In PACE, districts must meet guardrails before even joining PACE. In the old system, where state-level assessments were developed, and in the last 2 instances, New Hampshire was part of nationally developed assessments. With PACE assessments, they're developed locally, and the system is state and local in design. where in the old system, annual determinations were based solely on those state assessments. In the new system, annual determinations are based on multiple measures, including local assessments. In the old system, where there often are two systems, state and local, and when you listen to superintendents talking to their school boards, they say, well, that's the state system, but let me tell you what we're really doing. In this system, the local communities and educators own the single system of accountability. And also, in the old system, educator development is tied to school improvement after assessment results are released, whereas in the new system, intensive educator development occurs prior to joining PACE and continues all along the way as they're using curriculum-embedded assessments. Next slide. So PACE is also different as an accountability system in that it is not statewide, but involves those districts that have demonstrated readiness for the pilot. And as you can see here, in our first year, we had 4 districts, Rochester, Sanborn, Epping, and Sauhegan. Year 2, we added Concord, that's this year, Concord, Monroe, Pittsfield, and a charter school, Seacoast Charter School. And then we have a number of other districts, actually more than the ones that are listed on this slide, that are kind of staged for moving on. And I might say that we are actually holding back because the U.S. Department of Education asked us to extend our pilot from 2 years into next year as well, and but they asked that we stay with the original 8 implementing, and we added 1 more. We negotiated 1 more, and then we have the others staged and ready to go. Next slide. So here's another task. This is really a 4th grade, 4th level science task called the solar cooker. Students are asked to study how heat transfers and to design something that will raise the temperature of water solely using the power of sunlight. They start in teams but are asked to do the research and designs independently. They need to build a solar cooker and test it to see if it actually works. And they take down data regarding temperature increase or perhaps no increase. As you can see here, this assessment is aligned to the next generation science standards, whereas the previous assessment was aligned to New Hampshire's college and career ready math standards, and we build our competencies against the Common Core, which we refer to as college and career ready English language arts and math standards. We also look to see how students are able to collaborate with each other and to communicate their findings in the previous assessment. And these metacognitive skills really become more and more essential in these complex tasks and are more indicative of what students will be facing in careers and in college as they leave school. They're not a part of the accountability system, but we're still measuring them, and we're taking a look at what that information is telling us before we actually add it to accountability. Next slide. So I'd like to pause here and see if there are any questions so far. I'm going to start to talk about how we got approval and really give some insight as to innovation and demonstration authority demonstration pilots going forward in the next section, but I wanted to see if anyone had questions as to how we're actually doing this work.
Hi, Paul. This is David.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, sorry for dropping out. The internet decided that it didn't want to work for me for about 3 minutes, but we're back. So we got a question from the audience. If you could talk about the size of these districts and how they were selected to participate in the PACE group.
Right. Well, New Hampshire is a small state with a good number of small districts, and so they have actually anywhere from the smallest district has a single school of 500 students to the largest district in our current group of 8 having 6,000 students. So as you can see, it's quite a range, and the largest district, as I mentioned, I believe has 9 schools as part of the district. We also, in our staging group, we have districts that cover multiple towns, multiple high schools, and are larger than the largest district currently in. So that's the size of what we have. Okay.
What was the process for selecting the districts? How did they come to be the pilot sites?
Okay. So essentially what was negotiated with the U.S. Department of Education was a series of guardrails. We made the case that we would only bring folks into this new model if they were ready to do it. So they had to be implementing competency education in their classrooms, where students demonstrated their learning, their mastery of learning, that their assessment and grading system was built on a competency-based system, and that students were moving on when ready and really taking advantage of the power of competency education, more deeply engaged in complex projects. They also had to have been involved in training in how to construct complex performance tasks and how to score them, and then gone through a fairly rigorous calibration and social moderation process, large-scale social moderation process, so that we knew we could demonstrate reliability within the system. Also, they had to agree to use the competencies that are state-level model competencies that were constructed by New Hampshire educators and written against the standards that I referenced earlier. And then lastly, there had to be a commitment on the part of the school board and the leadership of the district and the schools that they would implement these large-scale complex performance tasks, and that they would implement common performance tasks that were constructed across districts as checks for calibration purposes. So all of those things needed to be agreed upon before a district would be brought into implementation status. So it's a pretty rigorous process, and really changes the whole construct of what we think of accountability, where everyone's held to the same standard, whether they're ready for it or not.
Thanks, Paul. We have another question, which you may be addressing in the second half of your presentation. It's asking about whether or not you have suggestions for building momentum around the work. And this participant is talking about the fact that they have many small districts of less than 800 students.
Right. Well, I think I will get to that. Why don't we get right into the next section, and I think I have a slide that's actually going to address the issue of scaling and momentum. And why don't you just click one more time. There you go. Okay, so I also thought it might be instructive to share with you a little of the timeline for approval of the New Hampshire PACE pilot with the U.S. Department of Ed. We first met with Secretary Duncan in 2012, and after that meeting we realized we were actually not ready to implement a wholly new system. We had not constructed the elements of the system, nor had we prepared our partners at the local, state, or national level. And so it took us a full 2 years till we did finally meet again with the Secretary, where he gave us the verbal go-ahead to move forward with the pilot with close guidance by then Assistant Secretary Deb Delisle and her staff. And on March 3rd of that year, 2015, we received our official approval. And as we understand, we had Deb Delisle up here, and I know the folks from Ohio know her well. We had her up here actually just this past weekend, and she shared that it was quite a battle inside the U.S. Department of Ed as to whether they would actually give us this waiver. And what you might ask, what is the waiver? The waiver is that we only do annual state assessments, large-scale state assessments at grade spans, and that the performance assessments are given in intervening grades. So we weren't really able to do this without having constructed the system, provided deep professional learning opportunities for our educators, and then designing the whole system before we received final approval. The final approval really just allowed us to move to these grade span state assessments from annual state assessments. But meanwhile, we had to have the whole system in place, and I refer to them as our hardy band of initial implementing districts really were hell-bent to make this happen whether we were approved or not, and pretty much told us they were going to go forward whether they had gotten approval. Next slide. And I don't want it to seem like it was a simple or smooth process, because we know it wasn't. Even today, we feel like it was a little like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain. And even then, in September 2014 meeting with the Secretary, we encountered strong doubt that we could do this. So to counter this concern, next slide, and there you go. We emphasized our message, that is through the deep engagement, energy, and work provided by our local partners that this can and will be done, and it is through this design that we can better support deeper student learning at the instructional core. Next slide. We actually had our local leaders at the meeting, and they shared their plans and thoughts, and the curriculum and assessment administrator for the Sanborn Regional New Hampshire School District, Ellen Hume Howard, was particularly articulate as to all of the planning and work that her district had put into the pilot in the system. And it was really after hearing Ellen that both the Secretary and the Assistant Secretary agreed in principle to the concept of our pilot, and said if others did this kind of legwork, it would really make it easier for the department to support innovative practices. The other really big decision point was whether the Secretary had confidence that Commissioner Jenny Berry and I, as the Deputy Commissioner, could provide the leadership to make this work and stay close enough to the districts to make it work. And we definitely felt that we had given them that assurance. Next slide. So even though this is an innovative pilot based on competency attainment, you should know that this design was transitional in nature to meet all of the expectations under the No Child Left Behind waiver era when it was first approved. And our competencies are based on national and state standards, as I shared. So there's a strong expectation of competency-based instructional system that supports personalized learning and students moving on when they demonstrate mastery. The local system is designed to follow trajectories of competency development for students in order to demonstrate growth. And we do use the Smarter Balanced Assessment System once in elementary, once in middle school, and now we use the SAT in high school to check that students are growing developmentally. We also construct one common PACE performance task for each content area to be administered annually, not to take the place of the large-scale state assessment, but as a check on the local body of assessments that educators are using to track student learning and progress. Next slide. So our goal has been to provide a much more emphasis on student mastery of deeper learning as coverage of a broad range of standards. And as we've done this, we really remain highly committed that all students gain from the process, particularly those who are educationally disadvantaged. This system was designed to emphasize a really local internal accountability process where educators identify the competencies, build the assessments to hold themselves accountable, and are supported by their local boards and leaders. The state trusts, but we also verify that a quality process is taking place. And so New Hampshire, through federal sources and through the generous support of a number of foundations, have provided substantial support to the participating districts, but it is also the expectation that the local districts will provide supports as well, including leadership and the time to do the work of constructing, implementing, and scoring the assessments. Next slide. Here's the build-out of the assessment schedule through grade levels. Note that Smarter Balanced is in red once each in English Language Arts and Math and grade spans, and at least one common performance PACE task is given each in English Language Arts, Math, and Science through intervening years for calibration processes, and then we have the SAT moving from Smarter Balanced to the SAT this past year. Next slide. Here's a snapshot of both the state and local assessments being given by one of our participating districts in English language arts. These assessments are aligned and connected to the same sets of standards and competencies from the local to the state level. As you can see, the state column is all the way to your right, the district level is next to it, and then the local classroom assessment grading is also shown here. Next slide. So we tell the many states and districts that have come to observe our work that if you want something that's easy to implement, then don't choose this model. However, if you want to build your educators' expertise, re-engage your community in ownership of their educational system, and support students in deeper, more authentic work that is competency-based, then this is an approach that could possibly work for you. Next slide. Here's our design model where we have multiple assessments at the local level on the left, assessing student mastery of competencies, as well as smarter, balanced, and paced common assessments at designated levels, all of which combined into competency scores for students and for the schools themselves, expressed as comparable annual determinations across the PACE schools, and through comparability studies done for us by the National Center for Assessment, really one of our core partners in our work, that demonstrate our comparability with non-PACE districts as well. Next slide. In our negotiations with the U.S. Department of Education, the ability to produce comparable annual determinations across the pilot and comparable to all New Hampshire districts has been key to the expectations. So annual determinations are essentially declarations of proficiency for students. In the last 15 years, these have been primarily based on a single assessment or in multiple assessments, all given to all students. By combining a basket of measures and demonstrated alignments, for example, the performance level descriptors for PACE are essentially the same as the performance level descriptors for Smarter Balanced, and then having various studies of comparability across districts and a cross-district standard setting process for cut scores, and a common reporting system for both PACE and non-PACE districts, we've been able to create a coherent system during the years of the pilot demonstration, and we have been able to implement this now going into our second year. Next slide. So ultimately, the annual determinations are based on the full set of local, common, and state assessments given to each student in each grade, 3 through 8, and in high school. Cut scores have been based on average competency score distributions across a given school based on 4 different achievement levels. Again, I want to emphasize the score is not based on the single common PACE performance task administered in a given year, but on the full body of evidence developed locally. The common PACE task is really just a calibration tool to see if there is reliability and validity in educator scoring. Next slide. So here you can see the results from last spring from the first 4 districts of their English Language Arts annual determinations. In simple lay terms, level 3 was determined to be competent, level 4 above competent, level 2 not yet competent, and level 1 is basic skills. As you can see, there is a distribution based on these local curriculum embedded assessments that is pretty similar to the what you find with the large-scale state assessment of Smarter Balanced shown in red. Next slide. This can be seen better with the bar graph, where the percentage of students scoring competent or better are pretty close to how students score on the achievement level of Smarter Balanced. Next slide. Here we see the distribution of competence achievement level scores by disaggregated groups. And we see that we have work to do with students with disabilities, and particularly with students with disabilities who are economically disadvantaged, which also our core or basic accountability system also tells us. But by showing this distribution through this system, it shows that we do get the disaggregation necessary for an accountability system. Next slide. Here's the math distribution, and again we see a fair representation of the distributions between Smarter Balanced and PACE. They're not quite as close as they were with English language arts, but they're not substantially different either. Next slide. However, as we look at the graphical depiction, even though each bar represents a different cohort of students, we see that there is the possibility that educators are scoring students higher locally than students are scoring on the state assessments, and that there may be a decline overall as students progress through the grade levels. These findings are actually consistent with what we have found with those districts and schools that are not in PACE, and historically with the New Hampshire Common Assessment System, or NECAP, as well as with our first year of Smarter Balanced results for non-PACE districts. And what it tells us is that we have to really focus on educator grading and scoring of work and rigorous, holding students to rigorous standards. Next slide. Here we have the disaggregation for math, and again we see we have much work to do with certain subgroups, and we have teams of educators internal to our districts and across PACE looking at how we will address these issues. You may know that on both Smarter Balanced and on NAEP assessments, New Hampshire is consistently in the top 2 to 4 performing states in the country. Nevertheless, the data findings that we're seeing here gives us information necessary for continued improvement, something we're taking very seriously as we go forward in coming years. And of course, the U.S. Department of Education wants to know that we have an improvement system that is tied to our accountability system. But in this system, since the educators are constructing the evaluations and the assessments themselves, they are also constructing the improvement systems. They believe in the system, they construct it, they want it to work as they feel a high sense of ownership to it. So next slide. So we have learned much already, even after almost 2 years into the pilot. Collaborative capacity building among educators has been key to the process. Our educators across the board talk about this training as the best professional learning that they have had in their careers. The implementation of reciprocal expectations between educators, leaders, schools, and districts in the state has really driven tremendous energy and excitement about the emerging system. Cross-district calibration, the development of comparable annual determinations, and the development of useful data for student improvement have all been demonstrated through the first year and now into the second. So we think that as we enter ESSA with the Identified Innovative Assessment and Accountability Demonstration Authority, that we may be seeing a whole new era for public education, one where educators are once again at the center of standard development, of assessment and of accountability, based on a richer set of tasks and multiple assessments, on increased skill and capacity of educators, and on a greater reliance on proven educator judgment. I think that's all the slides I have. And now are there questions? I can see there's at least one. Can I address the process we use to validate common performance-based assessments? And also local performance-based assessments. Good question. We actually have a multiple level of calibration. First, the individual teacher, if the work is being done in the classroom with an individual teacher, will score the task results. Then another teacher in the same school will score the results, so there'll be double scoring. And then within the district, they'll take a sample of tasks of student work and score those in groups. And then in the summertime, we have a 3-day calibration process where we bring teams of educators from all of the implementing schools together, and they score together, and they're paired with educators from different schools, and they're given work from a third school. And so they're able to look at student work, both of their own students, of students in their own school, but not in their class, across their district, and then across all of the districts. And what we have found is incredible conformance, if you will, in terms of agreement of the rubrics. And a lot of this had to do with all of the training that had taken place, not just in the scoring and calibration process, but in the actual construction of the rubrics. We don't use a common rubric. Every task has a rubric that has been constructed by groups of New Hampshire educators for that task, and so there's some, they're very explicit in terms of expectation. So that's how we've handled the calibration and moderation process.
Thanks, Paul. This is Wendy. And were you working with any outside groups, universities, et cetera, to do that kind of preparation for folks and to
yes,
work on that?
Really the three big groups that we've been working with have been initially the Center for Collaborative Education out of Boston, built what was referred to as the Quality Performance Assessment Professional Development Model, and that's what we used for construction of complex performance tasks, and we had them really run all of our training for that purpose. Then after that, we brought in the National Center for Assessment, where they trained in the calibration processes, and they also reviewed the tasks for rigor and quality. And then we had a double-blind review of tasks by the Stanford Center scale run by Ray Bichon. And so we actually have two task banks. We have a local in-state task bank for our common PACE assessments, but we also have all of our local assessments reviewed and put up on the Stanford task bank and for general use by our educators in New Hampshire, and really others can use them as well.
Okay. David and Frank, have you been observing any other questions you'd like to pose to Paul?
Wendy, while they're thinking, could I just also respond to an earlier question? I actually thought I had a slide in here that was going to address scaling, but I must have taken it out at the last minute. But we have built a tiered system of supports by which we support districts in just implementing competency education. We refer to them as our Tier 3 educators, and we have lots of training and professional development and technical assistance to those schools and teams of educators in that effort, including the Center for Innovation in Education from the University of Kentucky and Two Revolutions and the NGLC group that tied to EDUCAUSE, Andy Calkins and his team. So we have a number of support folks providing support around implementing competency education. The next tier is the building of the tasks, and that's supported primarily by the Center for Collaborative Education. But the way it works now is districts enter PACE and typically enter in that Tier 3 when they're successful after a year or more there. They enter Tier 2. Once they've completed that, they enter Tier 1 and start to implement. And so that's how we're scaling this and how we're bringing folks along, even if they're not fully prepared to do all of this preparatory work on their own. We're providing them pretty substantial degrees of professional development and technical assistance, and we're able to do that because not everybody's coming in at once, and we're starting to bring them in full regions of our state. We have 5 technical assistance regions, and we're kind of going around our state and providing these tiers of support through a regional approach.
Thanks, Paul. Can you also talk a little bit about how you might be refining your state-level supports based on any kind of conversation that happens between these pilot sites of various tiers and the SEA staff?
Right. We have actually a policy table, we refer to it as. We meet once a month with the points of contact from each district that's involved, and we discuss the construction of the system. We do this together along with the Center for Assessment, and some of our State Department consultants. And so this is something we all own together, and we all construct it together. And when we make changes in the system, we all vote as to what it's going to look like. So we know then that there's going to be ownership in the system. Also, I would just say that we also meet fairly regularly individually with the leaders of each district to get their input as to what's working and what's not. When you're constructing a wholly new system like this, it's absolutely essential that you kind of keep your ear really tight to the ground as to how it's working, what needs to be improved. We have changed some of our technical assistance providers when we found that some have been less effective than others, and we've realigned our processes so that we can make them more efficient and effective and best meet our educators' needs. Lastly, I'll just say we have actually set up a third-party institute now in our field called the New Hampshire Learning Initiative that's actually taking control over the whole system, and they are hiring leaders from the original 4 districts who will actually be leading the curriculum instruction and assessment systems and hiring lead teachers in the construction of the tasks. So, we're really trying to embed this entire system at the local level so that, one, it'll be less dependent on some of the state political, winds, if you will, blowing to and fro, but also to really emphasize the ownership at the local level.
Thanks, Paul. I'd love to hear from some folks out in some of our states. I know we have Ohio, and we have a representative from Illinois and Michigan on the call. Please either request to be unmuted or post a question for Paul.
Well, I have this question. This is Frank, and I'm thinking of when I used to work in the schools, and you mentioned in your last comment how you're trying to get this rooted at the local level because so that the concept would not be vulnerable to the whims that are at the state level. And I was thinking that, well, there's in some districts there's a lot of turnover, and it's really hard to get a concept, to get a practice into the system, to get it systemic. That at the district level, just as at the state level, a good idea can be vulnerable and can be lost with staff turnover or with leadership turnover. Can you share conversations you've had about that and what we might do about that?
That's a great question, Frank. And so what we found now, to some degree, some of this might be because we're kind of in a first-in-the-nation status and gotten lots of attention nationally and in state, but there's a lot of folks focused on this, and it's highly attractive from that standpoint. So we have a lot of educators wanting to get into this system. So actually, folks are applying to fill whatever vacancy are being found in these implementing districts because folks want to be involved in this kind of education. So that's a good thing. And do we expect that'll continue? Maybe, maybe not. But already we're starting to see turnover at both the district and the educator level, and also at the principal level. But what we're seeing actually is movement between the implementing districts. So one of our lead curriculum and assessment assistant superintendents from Rochester just was hired as a superintendent in another district who wants to implement PACE, so they thought they'd go ahead and poach her, which was a smart idea for them. But then Rochester, which was actually our largest district in PACE in terms of implementation, lost their key player. So they ended up hiring the high school principal from Epping, which is another implementing district, a person who was ready to reach to the district level. And they hired him because he had implemented PACE in his high school. And so his assistant principal in Epping is now being promoted as the new principal in Epping. So that's what we're seeing, and what we're really emphasizing is the networking of educators, both vertically and horizontally across these districts. We create all kinds of opportunities where they're communicating and working together. They have a common vocabulary, a common interest, a common kind of purpose in how they're working on education overall, and certainly in building the system. And so they're really very committed to one another. It's really been quite remarkable to watch the degree. And then the last thing I'd just share, you didn't ask this, but I'm going to share it. We took our state board to Sauhegan High School, and they were doing a science day that day, and so the state board visited, I think it was 6 different projects going on in Sauhegan High School right across the whole school, teams of educators and teams of students involved in large-scale tasks. One of those tasks was the Common PACE performance task. And so when the state board members came back to their room to hold their meeting, the first question I asked them is, so tell me which one was the Common PACE performance task. They actually couldn't tell me which one it was. They had guesses, but the guesses were not correct. And so essentially what this told them and showed us was that the degree of the embedded nature of these performance tasks in the work that's going on in the school at a regular basis has been pretty deep. And so that has excited our educators and continues to draw them to the work as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. If I may, just one more question. This is still Frank. So maybe I missed this in your presentation, but what can you say about the profile of the schools and districts that are participating? You know, in terms of level of performance.
It's actually a full range. We have several schools that are in the top 10% of performance, and we have, I think, 4 or 5 schools that are actually in the bottom 25% and two schools that are in the lowest 5%. So we have actually a full range of performance amongst the schools and educators. And what we have found actually is by bringing the educators together, treating them as equals. I mean, not to say that they don't recognize, you know, if somebody comes from this school, you know, probably they're performing at a higher level than they might be, but it's that sense that they're working together on a common problem, on a common project, holding themselves to common expectations and standards that really builds that sense of coherence across the schools and across the educators.
Thank you.
Hi, Paul. One of our participants has posed a question about preparing families for the changes that were inherent in the CBE initiative in New Hampshire, and I would probably add to that, you know, preparing staff across the board. So I'd love for you to speak to that question.
Well, I think I talked a little bit about preparing staff. That was the whole tiered approach. What we find is that schools, certainly as our public education system is, from a traditional standpoint, doesn't move, doesn't change, doesn't transform very quickly, and there are a lot of folks who are fairly invested in the existing system. And so, it takes a fair amount of both high-level leadership at the school and district level, as well as the school board level, to move to a different expectation. So again, because we are selecting those who are choosing to be a part of this, they are not being told they have to, they are choosing to be a part of this, and then essentially giving these guardrails that they have to have accomplished to enter, that has made a huge difference in terms of of addressing that issue. Now, in terms of community, parents, students, that's a whole different conversation, and I think it really, where we have found this most to come forward is in the whole area of student grading. Folks probably are aware that as you really move to a competency-based system, your grading practices really change fairly dramatically, and there's a range of reactions to that, from, you know, if it was good enough for me, to it should be good enough for my kids and why are you changing it, to those parents who have high-flying students and are worried that changing the grading system will negatively affect their future. There are lots of concerns out there. So what we really like to see, actually, is as schools and districts enter this, that they've already started to go through that process with their community and share why competency education really is a better approach, in that it, you know, for a student to advance, they really have to demonstrate that they know and are able to do the work that is expected of them, that they're not just part of a cohort that will be passed along whether they've mastered the work or not. And, you know, making that case, showing what it means, showing what it means in terms of our students succeeding in careers in college on beyond is really critical to this larger effort. I think we've really started to turn the corner around why this is so important, and many of our communities have really started to move in this direction. And frankly, what we're now seeing is our communities going to our educators and saying, you know, why aren't you going faster? Why haven't you implemented this more intensively than you have to date? So that's, to me, a good sign.
Paul, on the subject of grades, David had mentioned in his introduction that they're beginning some work on articulation agreements with higher ed. Have you addressed this issue at all, and can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I will say that there's been lots of work around articulation with higher education in New England. When we first started doing competency education, we started meeting with admissions officers all across our state. But given the fact that New England kind of functions as a region, almost as a single state, you know, many of our students go on to college in Massachusetts or Maine or Vermont or Connecticut and on beyond. We really felt we needed a more regional approach. So as we're a part of what's called the New England Secondary School Consortium here in New England, and the Great Schools Partnership, which is our primary technical assistance provider, has gone through a whole process with college and university presidents all across New England, and now going across the country, getting them to sign on to proficiency-based or competency-based graduation requirements and transcripts. And so most all of the higher ed institutions in New England have essentially signed on to that. Now, how that's actually implemented on a case-by-case basis, on a school-to-college basis, still takes some conversation and negotiation, but it's no longer a new conversation. And actually, it's more, frankly, more an issue of fit. If you have a student who comes out of a very highly personalized, student-centered, competency-based environment, you know, are they going to want, you know, to choose to go to the University of Massachusetts, which may not be so student-centered, personalized, or competency-based? So we started to see selection on both sides being more critical in terms of the methods of teaching and learning.
Thanks. I want to just see if any of my organizers have any additional questions before we move along.
No, I appreciate this, Paul. Thank you very much. And Wendy, thank you too. Your presentation is so comprehensive, and your responses are, I mean, they fill in so much detail that this is a lot, and thank you.
I would also just add, and the organizers and I had talked about this beforehand, I had shared a paper also. It's actually a newspaper article, if you will, locally about implementing competency-based grading practices, and it might be something that you'll want to share with the participants. They might find it interesting to see the levels of reactions by students, educators, parents, and others as that system is implemented.
Great. And before we just move on to our last couple of slides, Paul, I'm wondering, because we do have some states in the region who are just sticking their toe in the water, any, mulligans that you did along the way that you, if I had only known ... that you could offer as a piece of advice for those folks who are just embarking on this journey?
Yeah, I think the biggest piece, which is, pretty much embedded in all the things I've said, is what we've learned is local educators and local districts and communities really need to choose to go to this level of transformation. This is not something that we believe you can just tell people they must do. And so I would really strongly urge folks not to try to move in this direction from a top-down standards-based accountability approach, but rather from a kind of a ground-up building and supporting folks as they move forward. That's been our biggest learning. We actually did require initially competency education in our high schools, and it really met with some mixed results. So what we look at in terms of policy, we look at it as enabling and supportive, and then provide systems of support to our educators as they move forward, rather than just saying, well, thou shalt do this now, and expecting that it's going to be done in any kind of quality way.
Great. Well, I know I speak on behalf of all the organizers in thanking you for all your comments. We're going to just wrap up now, but I hope you stay on the line in case there's anything else that occurs to you. Can you advance the next slide, Cora? And the next one? And the next one. And pop it through. So we have a couple of partner organizations that we work with. We did have Mark Williams on the line. I think he had to run, but the Centers for Innovations on Learning does a lot of work around competency-based education and has just released a new handbook on personalized learning that includes some chapters that really look at what do we mean by competencies and how does it relate to personalized learning. Next slide. And next slide. We also have as one of our partners the CCSSO group, in particular the ILN network. And I know that Ohio, and Paul, if you want to say a few words about any experiences you've had with the ILN network, that would be great to chime in here.
Well, yes, I think that the discussions at the state level and the support at the state level, and having the national partners like Linda Darling-Hammond, like Jean Wilhoit at University of Kentucky, and a number of other partners around both policy and implementation has been critical to the success of many of our states as they've implemented this. And not just that, but when we started looking deeply at personalization, we sent groups and teams of educators to CISA 1 in Wisconsin, where they've been really implementing pretty strong personalized learning environments. So right across the states and the districts, the teamwork across the states is important, as well as the technical assistance.
Great, thanks, Paul. Okay, next slide, Cora. So this is our wrap-up. David and Frank, I don't know if you have any parting words, but I know I'd like to particularly thank Paul for joining us today, for all the tremendous work he's done over the past 2 decades and probably longer. And also thank the SEAs that were able to join us today. I know we have groups from Michigan, from Ohio. We've got some folks from Illinois who are on the call as well, and state managers from almost all of our 7 state region and directors. So does anyone have a last parting word they'd like to make before we close for today?
I'd also like to take an opportunity to thank Paul for participating and sharing his great insights. I know when we started discussing this webinar, Wendy, that immediately my mind went to Paul as a great resource, and just cannot thank him enough for the time that he's taken to help us prepare and to deliver this for everybody. And thank you for joining.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Great. And we will follow up with a copy of Paul's slides and the article that he mentioned and any other resources that we have available. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paul, and have a tremendous summer.